Let's have a word of prayer as we start. Heavenly Father, thank you for the privilege of being here with like-minded brothers and sisters. Thank you for the opportunity we have together to look to you, to show us more of your majesty and your power, more of the ways that we can understand that and appreciate it, and also to utilize it to advance your kingdom. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, I want to talk today about something that I only got interested in about 10 years ago. And it had to do with helping poor people in developing countries. I have done that in rather small ways over the years. My wife and I had the opportunity to live in Brazil for 6 months. In 1974, we became very acquainted with sort of the very difficult situation that people who live in developing countries experience. And Brazil is actually probably one of the better of the developing countries. It's not as poor as other places. I've since had the opportunity to travel to many other places like the Philippines and Indonesia and Kenya and Armenia, and there's a widespread poverty problem in many places around the world. And we live in a somewhat insular situation in the United States, so we're not always so aware of that, although with television, I think today we're much more aware of it than I was growing up, when we simply had almost no exposure. My way of helping in the past has been to sort of adopt children through World Vision. We had 5 kids for probably 35 years, and now we have some from Armenia. And so just giving money, and maybe to orphanages, we've done various things. But in a way, what we can do financially, directly, is probably pretty modest, being a college professor. On the other hand, it dawned on me some years ago that if I could do some things through the research I was doing as an engineer, using the gifts and talents and experience that God's given me in that area, I could potentially do a huge amount compared to what I could ever do writing checks. And so I've spent the last few years working on something that I think is going to end up being maybe 100 times more significant, maybe even more than 100 times more significant than what I've been doing. And what I'm sharing today, I hope, will be an encouragement to each of you to also think maybe about creative ways God might have you operate, so to speak, outside the box, and be able to make a much, much bigger difference than you might have thought possible if you were just thinking in general of going on a week-long missions trip or writing a check, which is better than not doing anything, but maybe suboptimal. So let's talk about this. As we look around the world today, there is a great need, and it's very difficult to go to places that look like this, and I've been to places that look exactly like this in Brazil, and say God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life, and then take no concern for how absolutely difficult their lives are. I think that it makes a lot more of a meaningful presentation to go and say, God loves you and He cares about you, and I'm here because I'm concerned about your spiritual well-being and your material well-being, and I'm going to commit myself to helping see that situation change. I think you almost have to minister the way Jesus did, in which He always took full account of people's physical as well as their spiritual needs and ministered to both concurrently, and I think that's a good model for ministry today. If you look around the world, I'm particularly interested in, or have gotten interested through a former PhD student in that, in the situation with people who are coconut farmers. Coconuts grow within plus or minus 20 degrees of the equator, and so this is kind of the band where they are. On the map, the darkness of the colors of the countries tells you something about their economic well-being, and you can see most of the countries in this band between the blue lines are very lightly colored, which means very, very low income. Many of the people living at $2 a day. There are 50 billion coconuts that grow every year, and there are about 10 million coconut farmers, typically with about 6 kids apiece, so about 80 million people who depend on, in a sense, the coconut economy for their income. They typically make about $500 per year per family. So this is very, very difficult. And none of the kids go to school because they can't afford it. Even education's free. They have to pay for books and uniforms, and they can't afford to do that. So here's what, there are 50 billion of these per year that are harvested. The primary reason for coconut harvesting is to extract the coconut oil. And most of the shell and the husk is actually discarded. So our immediate thought as we got into this was if there's some way we could figure out some applications for the shell and for the fiber and the husk, then we might be able to take what is agricultural waste today, for which they get nothing, and be able to create some value. I visited a place in Indonesia where they throw away 5 million husks per day in an area, mostly individual farmers just put it out the curb every day. 5 million per day. If you wanted to buy these husks, you could get 1,000 of them in a dump truck load for $3, and that was just the pickup and delivery charge. So the farmers got nothing out of this. My background is material science and engineering. Like Bill, I'm a fake mechanical engineer, but I do a lot of stuff that mechanical engineers need to do, which is materials and light prediction and so forth. So here's what we basically have to work with. The main thing that's used is the copra, from which they extract coconut oil, or maybe they make confections for cookies and stuff. But the shell, the fiber, and the powdery material that's called pith that's inside the husk along with the fiber are basically the things that are poorly utilized and represent an opportunity. And I think there's a general principle here, and the general principle is 80% of the people who make $2 a day or less, 80% of the 2.7 billion people are farmers. If you want to help the biggest number of poor people in the world, then figure out a way to help poor farmers. The approach that I'm taking is to say there's lots of agricultural waste, and because it's waste, if we could figure out what it could be useful for, then we could give some value to what is today a throwaway for them, maybe even burned, and that actually is environmentally bad. Okay, so here's what we're talking about. We've got different components of the coconut. We're trying to figure out how we can add value to each one of these things and make use of them. One opportunity would be to go from what I would call from cash. We want to go from trash to cash. I got this backwards, okay? We want to convert large piles of coconut husks, that's what these are, that accumulate any place where there's lots of coconut farmers and where they're producing coconut oil. And we would like to be able to convert this into automobile components. These are things like trunk liners for your cars. When you open up the trunk lid, if you look at the floor and all the side panels and the part that's on the lid of your trunk as you open it up, these are all made with something called non-woven fabric composites. Typically they're polypropylene and polyester. What we're doing is essentially replacing all the polypropylene with coconut fiber, typically 50 to 60%, and then processing it in exactly the same way it's normally processed. The coconut fiber can be much less expensive than the polypropylene. It provides a stiffer and we think higher quality product, and it's greener, more sustainable. So it really is a pretty attractive proposition. The way this works is if you look at the picture here, we've got a slice of the coconut husk that we're going to then separate into pith and fiber. You can see in the slide B. The pith is really kind of the matrix sap that's in the husk. When it dries out, it becomes powdery instead of sappy. The pith actually absorbs 10 times its weight in water, so it has some great applications for gardening. We also thought children's diapers, but then we checked with what they were already using, and what they're already using absorbs 50 times its weight in water, so we thought, oh crud, maybe diapers for third world countries. We can't afford the more expensive ones that they sell in the States. And then of course the fiber. The fiber is quite stiff compared to most synthetic fibers and actually most other natural fibers. So we're going to take the coconut fiber, combine it with, in this case, I guess polypropylene. We're going to leave out the polyester. So, but you can combine it with one or the other, and you make a non-woven fabric, and then the non-woven fabric can be heated, put on a mold, pressed into a shape, and you get something that has the different car parts. As you see here, the door panel made with coconut shell powder. or coconut fiber, excuse me, and the other made with all synthetics. Pictures E and F basically show you what this looks like if it were made with two synthetics, polyester and polypropylene. The one on the right is coconut fiber and polypropylene, okay? So this is what it looks like after pressing, but what the parts look like macroscopically is what you see over here.
How does strength be achieved there?
We're much more concerned about stiffness. The strength would be similar, but much better stiffness. And most of these parts are limited by stiffness, not by strength, okay? Okay, so from the fiber we can make all kinds of parts for cars. We can also make seat cushions. There's a lot of things we can make with fiber. We actually got a award, which I'll mention at the end of this presentation, with Ford, and they're already beginning to use our materials in their automobiles. Okay, so what are we going to do with the shell? You guys know what I'm talking about. If you go to the store next time, pick up a coconut. They sell their produce, and just thump on it with your ring. It's really hard. It has a density of 1.2 grams per cubic centimeter. Maple hardwood is only 0.6. Pine is 0.3. Normally hardness and density go hand in hand. This stuff is really super hard. And the question is, what can you do with it? Okay, it was a little easier to think what you could do with fiber. And the thing we came up with was to say we're going to convert this coconut shell, take advantage of its hardness by creating very fine powder using coconut shell, incorporating that into plastics like polypropylene to use as a stiffener and a strengthener. So again, making a composite out of something that is now just a pure material. Okay, so the basic idea here is we're going to take a bunch of coconut shell. We're going to produce it by steps into some very fine powder, and then we're going to incorporate that powder into a plastic like polypropylene, and then you can injection mold it into all kinds of parts. I'll show you some examples. If you take the coconut shell powder and combine it with polypropylene, typically about 20 to 30% coconut shell powder, then you can injection mold it, and these are two simple examples of things you can make. But the business for polypropylene in just the United States is $15 billion a year. And so this is a huge opportunity. If we can sell a coconut shell powder that's cheaper than the price of the polypropylene, increases the properties of the polypropylene, which it does, and is also more sustainable, we'll be using less oil, then it makes a very attractive proposition. We're working with some major companies right now on all kinds of applications. Because when we have the coconut shell powder, we can increase the 20% coconut shell powder increases the stiffness by about 70%. 30% more or less doubles it. So if they don't need that much stiffness, they can actually make the parts thinner, because the material stiffness will compensate for the geometric contribution of stiffness. And so we're looking at things like car panels and all kinds of other consumer goods made with coconut shell powder as a functional filler in polypropylene. We think this will work in other materials as well. So we start with the coconut tree, and then we're going to take the coconut shell and we're going to process it. We recently purchased a plant in Indonesia for about $1.3 million that we're now using to produce coconut shell powder. It's then blended or mixed with polypropylene to make pellets that are a composite, and then injection molded into a wide variety of consumer goods. So this is really pretty exciting stuff. We have at least 5 or 6 different major companies that want to buy 20 to 40,000 pounds per month, and we can't produce that much yet, but we will be able to soon. We simply need to add more equipment to what we're doing and then improve a bit the processing rate in some of our different locations. The place where we've actually bought a plant is in Indonesia. Let's see if I can show you where on the map here. Okay, this is Indonesia. The largest number of coconuts in the world grow in Indonesia, 19 billion per year. There's a town up in northern Sumatra, which you can see is almost exactly on the equator, where there's a huge resource of coconuts, and that's basically where our plant is. So we're very excited In the place that we have done this, we have created 80 jobs, and we'll probably be creating several hundred more as we increase our production. So it's pretty exciting stuff. Okay, coconut shell powder. Here's what the coconut shell looks like. We're going to, it has the following properties. It's isotropic, hard, stiff, has a high lignin content, which means it's very resistant to pests. It's also very resistant to burning, has good thermal properties, and has a lower density than a lot of mineral fillers that are currently used. These are some micro pictures. Let me skip over some of this. Now, because I have limited time, let me share with you a couple of other examples that are not my own, but ones that I think are a good indication of what's possible. One of the people that I had met after I started working on this, but was a great encouragement to me, was a guy named Paul Public. He's written a book called Design for the Other 90%. If you're interested in helping poor people in developing countries, this is absolutely the best book I know on the subject. Now, he's a psychiatrist. He retired at 55 to work on trying to help poor people in developing countries. His first step was to decide what do poor people do, or what do they have, and found out 80% were farmers. And then he tried to figure out why most of their incomes were only $2 per day, or $500 or $600 per year, and concluded that many of these live in tropical regions where they have a wet season and a dry season, and they grow one crop a year. Now, the weather is suitable for growing 3 crops a year, except that they don't have water. Most of them live on places where the water table is relatively close to ground, and in many cases within 25 feet. So he decided if we could figure out a way to help them produce water and then distribute it during the dry season, they could go from 1 crop a year to 3 crops a year. So this is a really great idea when you think about it. And because they have water continuously, they don't have to use dry weather crops like wheat, which don't pay as well. They can grow vegetables and produce, things that have a much better cash value. It took him 6 years to figure out how to make this kind of drip irrigation system and a mechanical pump that you could operate like a stepper. If you go to the exercise gyms and you do one of these steppers, well, instead of just burning that energy doing nothing, it's hooked up to some suction pump that simply pump water. And because the places where these people are don't provide electricity, obviously. So it needed to be something that they can do without electricity that had to be very cheap. Now, I asked him how did he resolve all these things and figure out how to do this as a psychiatrist. It sounds like an engineering project. And he said, no. He said the most valuable tool I had in working with these people was I know how to listen. And I thought, that's true. He spent his whole career doing what? Talking to people, listening, asking questions, by and large. And so by interviewing over time about 3,000 poor farmers from many different places around the world, he developed he probably knows more about how poor farmers think, what they need, what they're willing to try, than anybody else in the world. They were able to finally make drip irrigation systems with a stepper pump that would pay back in less than 1 year. And the drip irrigation systems would last about 5 years. So it was a little bit of a hard sell at the beginning because a lot of these farmers couldn't imagine that this would all work and that it would pay back. But when a few farmers did it and had really good results, it didn't take very long for all the other farmers to catch on. And over the last 10 years, there have been 17 million families that have tripled their income. Documented. 17 million. More recently, his organization got a $15 million grant from the Gates Foundation to do more of the same kinds of things. And one of the interesting things that he pointed out was, he said, the reason this works is everybody in the food chain makes money. This is a market-driven process. The people, we figured out how to make drip irrigation systems and stepper pumps, but they're all made in country. Okay? So that creates jobs. 5 minutes? 10 minutes, okay. The people who sell the things make money, the people who help service it, and then the farmers get complete payback, so to speak, in terms of income in less than a year. So everybody's benefiting, and it's all done indigenously in country. He said one of the worst things that happened in his book, he tells this terrible story, and they got this all set in Bangladesh. It was going great, everybody was selling stuff, and it was working good. It was all self-sustaining. It was all done in country. And then some do-gooder organization like the United Nations comes along and says, well, look at what these guys are doing. This is really great. So they get some $50 million grant to come in and give everything away for free. And unfortunately, they have enough to give it away for free for a few people, but not for everybody. But over the time they were doing that, they essentially destroyed the little in-country industry that he had set up. Now, when they finish, then they march off, and there's nothing left behind. And this is often what happens, I think, in the way that we have well-intentioned projects that don't produce what I think of as sustainable indigenous help for poor people in developing countries. He gave another example. For example, after the earthquake in Haiti, what did we do? We sent billions of dollars worth of food to Haiti. Now, what happened with all the food that we gave for free? It essentially bankrupted most of the farmers in Haiti. Because why would anybody be paying for food when we're giving it all for free? We often do that with our agricultural surplus, don't we? We want to help out the rich agro businesses in the United States, not very few family farms anymore. So we take their surplus and we give it to poor countries, and then that sort of ruins it for in-country farmers. So I think there's a tremendous amount for us to learn as Christians on how we can actually get involved in doing this and doing it right. And one of the things I appreciate about Paul Pollock and his organization, IDE, which you can also Google search, is that they really do everything in a market-driven way. It's sustainable. It's helping people to help themselves. It's not doing just handouts. It's teaching them how to fish, not just giving them a fish. And I think the things that we need to do need to be something of that sort. We think what we're doing, I started a company several years ago. I took retirement from Baylor this year because I want to be able to work full-time with the company. We have about 15 employees. Have a major office with a research lab. But I think that the thing that we want to do as we work in country is we want to be able to provide good work environments, pay better than market wages, maybe significantly better if our margins are good enough to do that. We want to do it as we are doing it in Indonesia, at a place where the employees are primarily Muslims, and we want to do it in a way that benefits them and their families. When I was first there looking at all the coconut shell and coconut husks that were available, my first thought was, well, you can get all these you want for free. We'll pay them 2 cents a husk and give them some extra income. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but that would have increased their annual income by about 50%. Okay. My Indonesian friend said, you don't want to do that. If you do that, what they're going to do is they're going to go and get a second wife. And I thought, crap, I never would have thought of that. So if we just kind of got on without working with the locals, then 10 years later we would have said, we have been so successful working in Indonesia, we have doubled the rate of polygamy in Sumatra. What a great life accomplishment that is. Now, here's what they suggested. Why don't you do this? We can get Indonesian businessmen to help build a school. We can staff it with teachers from Christian universities. From there, and I have visited about 10 of these, and they have a lot of good Christian universities there. Even though they're a minority, a group in the country, a lot of the business people and so forth are ethnic Chinese that are Christians. And they said, we can staff the schools. You could use, instead of giving the coconut farmers from whom you're getting free husk and free shell, instead of giving the money, you can give them vouchers so their children can go to school. And I thought, wow, that sounds like a really good idea. We could give them fertilizer to double the yields on their trees. There's a bunch of ways we can benefit them. But instead of just handing them money, which may not be the best way to do it, if the market at the moment says these things are so abundant and poorly utilized that it's free, then for me to be paying stuff for them is to really try to distort the market, and that's usually a bad idea. My son, who teaches social entrepreneurship at Baylor, told me that's a really stupid idea, Dad, and just don't do it. Figure out how you can bless the community, but don't do it by trying to sort of distort the market. And then after talking to businessmen there, I became persuaded he was absolutely right. So sometimes it's difficult to figure out how to really help people in a way that's going to be long-term sustainable and helps them to develop their own independence. I think the people that Paul Pollock has helped and the people that we're trying to help are people who will have, if we're successful, a long-term source of demand for what it is that they have now as agricultural waste, and that will naturally then give them income or the benefits of that one way or the other. And so this is, I think, one way. It's not the only way, but it certainly is one way that we can be a blessing to people in developing countries. And so I would encourage you to give some thought as you travel in developing countries. I know a lot of people go on missions trips and they go in for a week and they build a house or do something like that, and then they sort of fly out of there. But while you're there, look around and see what's going on and try to imagine what things might you be able to do to help. Here's an interesting example. A friend of mine from Houston went to Africa on a missions trip, and he did a house building or whatever they did on the trip, something like that. And while he was there, he noticed that nobody had title to their land. Now, the area that he worked in was doing title insurance, okay? And so he knew all about this business of making titles and so forth. And so he went and actually talked to some government officials before he went home to see if they would be interested in having him help set up a title program for land, particularly for poor people in this country. And the government was actually quite interested in that. They didn't have anything against it. It's just nobody knew how to do it. So here he went back home. He spent some time working with them and eventually was able to set up a title program for the whole country, and particularly to benefit poor people. Rich people will have lawyers and stuff. They can get the title. It's the poor people that don't, and then they don't build anything on their land, not just because they're poor, it's because they don't own the land. You don't want to build a nice house or even a sort of a medium house on land you don't own. So once these people own the land and know that it's going to be theirs for the long term, they take care of it, they build something on it, and so forth and so on. I think there are so many different ways that God can use each of us with our different backgrounds and training and abilities, that when you have the opportunity to go overseas, don't just go do whatever little project that you're doing there. Pay attention and prayerfully look around and ask God to open your eyes so that you can see the neat opportunities that may just be there that would allow you to be a big blessing for the people where you're going. For me, I never would have thought about doing agricultural waste and making composite materials, because I spent most of my career making high-performance composites for the Air Force and NASA. The kind of stuff that's never going to help a poor person. It won't even help most of us because it's really, really expensive high-performance things. I'm getting the signal. I've got 1 minute to go, and I'm going to donate that 1 minute back to the conference schedule and open it up for questions, okay? But we think that we could easily create $25 million a year worth of economic cash flow in country. And when I think about the amount of money I've been able to give over my lifetime to help poor people develop the countries, this is going to be a slightly bigger deal than I've been able to pull off in the past. And it really makes me feel like, gosh, I wish I'd thought about this 30 years ago. I might have done a lot more, but sometimes we only figure out some of these things late in life. Some of you are much younger than I am, and so maybe you can get started at least paying attention and seeing. I know a bunch of you are in computer science, and computer science offers lots of interesting opportunities now with communications, because what does a poor farmer need to know? He needs to know what the real price of carrots are right now. He needs to know what the weather is going to be like for the next week or two. With the little simple communication tools, you can dramatically change the life of a village or particularly a farm community where they're often cheated because they don't know what the real price of stuff are, and they're dealing with middlemen, and they don't really, because they don't have the right information, then they don't play their cards the way that they might. Even just knowing weather forecast can be a big help. Okay, let's open it up for questions. Yes, sir.
What role did the Baylor students play in any of this?
I had students that were both undergraduate and graduate students who basically worked on research projects for which I got external funding through the National Collegiate Inventors and Innovators Alliance, and then eventually from the National Science Foundation. In 2009, we got a grant. When we started doing NSF stuff, we had to start a company because we were doing small business innovative research. But then we would have a contract with Baylor through the company, and so students were continuously working on it. I probably had 10 different students who had worked on it, and 6 of them are now employees, okay? So it worked out really well for them. We got them well trained and then we hired them. And Baylor owns the patents and gets a royalty and also owns a percentage of the company since I was working as a faculty member and using laboratory facilities on campus. So hopefully Baylor will get a big benefit out of this as well. And that would make me equally happy. But I'm especially concerned about the poor people in developing countries. And it looks like we've got a good shot at making a huge difference. I forgot to go back and show you, but we actually got an innovation award with Ford Motors this last year for using some of our non-woven fabric composites in their Ford Focus. And we're working with several different automotive companies on making all kinds of other parts with the coconut shell as well. But we're looking at other industries also. The automotive industry squeezes you really hard. They don't want to leave you any margins at all. But we have some great opportunities, yes.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the polypropylene substitution that you do with some of the components.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned something like 30% or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that that would also benefit the waste question, the environmental question, because if you showed, for example, a picture of a pulley that's usually done out of polypropylene.
Correct.
And now it's done out of a certain percentage of if that thing decays, it seems to be at least that part of it a natural decay process. Or am I missing something? It seems to be a good thing.
It would biodegrade more than a pure polypropylene, but more importantly, it recycles just fine.
Right.
We've actually run tests to show you can recycle it 5 times and still get pretty decent properties. And so I think for a lot of plastic stuff, unless you're talking about single service things that you get at McDonald's, let's say, a lot of the engineering applications, I want it not to be too biodegradable. We did some concrete foam houses made out of styrofoam in Armenia, and people were saying, "You're using styrofoam? That's not very environmentally friendly." And I said, "Well, I want this house to last forever. So why would I want a house that biodegrades, you know?" And so there are applications where you say biodegradability isn't always a virtue. Because in a car, for example, where it may be there for 15 years, I don't want it to be very biodegradable, but I'd like for it to be recyclable. And so it works well in that way, and it also reduces oil consumption. It has good properties. But I think if you're talking about stuff we use at fast food places, then I think biodegradability is important because that stuff does by and large go into the landfill. But if you're talking about engineering components, probably I don't want it to be too biodegradable. Yes?
In the places that you've worked, have you found that there is little to no connectivity for farmers then?
Little or no?
Little to no connectivity to the internet? For them to check prices, weather, techniques?
The places I've been, I don't think farmers had much of that sort of information readily available. Now, that's not true everywhere, okay? But I do think that's a big issue for people. If you think of how recently in the United States everybody's gotten on the internet, it's been really quite recent, and we're a country with a lot of resources and a lot of internet supply. But there are creative ways to do this. One of the great success stories of starting a small business and making a working country is the idea of using cell phones, where you rent your cell phone so many minutes a week to a lot of different people, because everybody can't afford a cell phone, but everybody wants to use one at least 15 minutes a week to talk to their families who live in a different location or so forth. And so one shared cell phone by 100 people ends up being affordable, where individual ownership is not. So again, I think in every one of these cases, there's ways to probably do this, but we need to learn to think outside the box, and we need to learn to do what Paul Cohen did. Talk to the people there. We often go in thinking they're stupid, we're smart, we know how to do everything, they don't know how to do anything. What you discover is a lot of these people are pretty resourceful. They just didn't have much in the way of options. And they understand their situation, and they have often very good ideas. If you can work with them and listen to them and take them seriously, then you can help to develop together solutions that they will actually use and hopefully maintain. I've seen lots of examples of projects that were done by kind of unilaterally, and people come in and do something, but the people don't have any involvement, they don't have any ownership in it, so to speak, and they don't maintain it, and 2 years later it's just sitting there resting. So the way we deliver our help is extremely important. We need to have humility going in as people who are going to partner with them, to learn from them, and then to help them together to develop good solutions. Other questions? Yes, sir.
So you mentioned that if besides the farmer technology involvement, there is any kind of other cultural involvement. You mentioned the Chinese schools. Any other type of cultural influence which you try to exercise?
Well, I think the idea of the school is it will be staffed by Christians. It will not be a Christian school in name, because it's in a part of Indonesia which is probably 95% or higher Muslim, and it'll just get burnt down. But by having Christian teachers there, they will have the opportunity over time to very gently, I think, introduce these kids, first of all, to a decent education, and secondly, to some understanding of Christianity and what its claims are, and how it could potentially benefit them. And I think when you go to do those kinds of spiritual missions, if you do that on the platform of having provided some very significant economic impact in the community, then I think your credibility coming as Christ's missionary, so to speak, goes way, way up. And so I think these people are spiritually impoverished, maybe even more than economically. But I think that their felt need immediately is their economic deprivation, and if you can help address that, then it opens the door, I think, to address their spiritual poverty as well. And everything we do is partnering with in-country people and Christian organizations, because we don't want to just be humanitarians. I think as a Christian that would be missing the opportunity to have a holistic ministry. We want to be doing it as just a holistic Christian ministry, but not always flying the flag. Okay, depending on where you are, you have to be as wise as the serpent and as gentle as the dove. Yes, other questions? Yes.
Didn't catch, did you say that you have a use for the husk fibers?
Yes, in the non-woven fabric composites that are for all your car parts, for example, we could make wheel wells out of them. We're looking at that. There's underhood parts, all the trunk trim, potentially some door panels or your package tray in the back of your car. There's about 110 pounds worth of stuff on your car that could potentially be made using non-woven fabric composites. Now, if you look at your car, it doesn't look like a non-woven because they put a fuzzy, let's say, polyester finish on it. Okay, and that's just a cover. It doesn't have any stiffness. What's behind it is what we're making. We've actually made parts, and they are being used in cars now. But if you looked at it, it would just look like a normal car part. The platform that cover rides on would be 50% coconut shell fiber, or coconut husk fiber, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. But there's other applications. We're looking at seat cushions for lawn furniture. We've got a big trial with a company coming up on that. There are a lot of different applications that we're exploring. Other questions? Yes.
Are you going to still work with Baylor students now that you've retired, or are you just going to have your own research to?
Well, I would if the company was located in Baylor, but in fact in Waco, but it's located in the research park at Texas A&M. And so we considered trying to stay in Waco, but there is a lot of synergism with the agricultural school there, with the Texas Transportation Institute, the Polymer Technology Center, which I started there 20 years ago. There were just too many good opportunities there, and they also offered us a real sweetheart deal to come because Texas Agricultural Experiment Station, which is the agricultural research arm of the state of Texas for all farmers, their biggest project for the next 10 years is to figure out how to better use agricultural waste. And when they found out what we were doing, they were very, very excited. And made us a really, really good deal to come. So, and since I'm retired and the lab that I was working in at Baylor is now being renovated into something else, then I don't have any facilities. And I won't have that much contact with students because I'm not teaching the materials courses that I've taught in the past. So we probably will maybe not be using that many Baylor students, except maybe as summer interns and potential hires. But, yes.
What's the about how much time was there between just the original idea of, hey, let's see if we can use coconut shells, to I have something that I'm ready to sell to Ford use?
Well, the first idea we had didn't work. This was the second idea. The first idea was to use coconut oil.
Right. I mean, from the time that you saw the coconuts,
Okay.
that they were.
Well, I started with coconuts, but we were going to use coconut oil and make ethanol and use those two together to make biodiesel for rural electrification. And if this had worked, then you could have bought a generator for people who live in most of the tropical villages, and they could have made their own biodiesel and been energy self-sufficient. And with electricity, it would have transformed their villages in a lot of really good ways. But we discovered you can't make it work unless you have 99.5% dry ethanol, and you cannot make that in a rural village. If we went to the chemistry department and got our ethanol, we made great biodiesel. If we added 0.5% water, we barely made biodiesel. If we added 1% water, we made soap. The whole chemistry changes, and we decided, I think making soap in rural villages is probably a good project. So, but we were really disappointed because that would have been even more significant than what we're doing now. So then we said, well, what else can we do? We already had gotten familiar with coconuts and realized a gallon of coconut oil makes 36 shells and 36 husks available. And there's a big, huge demand for coconut oil. So we moved on to doing that. We started working on coconut biodiesel in 2004, and by 2006 we knew that it worked great, except that you can't do it in village because they don't have methanol. And the same problem with why they don't have biodiesel would be they don't have methanol. It's very difficult to transport. It's explosive. It's poisonous. You don't want it in a rural village. The rural village would blow itself up. So then we switched over to doing materials, which actually worked better for me because that's what I really do for a living. And that started in probably 2006, and by 2008 we filed for our first patent, with a provisional patent. Late that year we started a company. We got our first SBIR funded in 2009. And the Small Business Innovative Research money we got from the National Science Foundation in 2009, they had 3,000 proposals, of which they funded 400 for 150 grand. Of that 400, the next year, they funded for Phase B 100. And then 2 years after, and that was 500,000, and then 2 years after that, the second one was a 2 year, we were one of 10 companies out of the original 3,000 that got funded for Phase 2 B extensions. So essentially, a lot of our research has been funded, and a lot of our working with companies and customers by our National Science Foundation. We got $1.1 million for that. But then we created 15 jobs. We created 80 jobs overseas. We also bought a place in Dominican Republic. We've raised $4 million in investor money. So, we're really making a big bet that this is all going to work. And, I think, we actually did our first investor raise in 2009, and then again in 2011. So I'll have to say, it seems like it's been forever. But people who told me when we were starting said, it's going to take you several years to get all this and up and going. And I kind of thought that's not true. But initially, we were not planning on owning production in country. We were going to try to work with in-country people and buy stuff from them, and then work with hopefully Christian business people who we could depend on to treat their in-country people well. And we could not get consistent supply. We couldn't get consistent quality. And we realized that we also have no real control over what they're doing to bless the people in country. And we didn't want to just have it be a windfall for somebody. So we finally bit the bullet, and went out and raised a bunch more money, because now we're buying facilities. $2.5 million of what we raised has been spent for buying production facilities. And owning and running those overseas is a much bigger challenge. So we thought we were going to generate technology, create markets, and license it, and keep it simple. But it couldn't be done. So, but I think if we had been successful that way, we probably wouldn't have accomplished our ultimate objective. So I think it's in God's providence that He said, we're not going to let it work this way, because I want you to be there where you can really help. I spent a week in Indonesia 2 weeks ago, and it was wonderful to go for the first time and see the plant and be with the people and interview a lot of the employees and find out there are a lot of them young guys with families who desperately needed a job and are getting paid a lot better than normal jobs in that area. So, yes?
Would it be possible for someone like me to get started doing something like this? Because it seems like you had the advantage of lots of previous senator and lots of connections and stuff. So
You know,
it's more something I might come up with an idea and then maybe build for it.
You know, if you have I think what you have to do is say, you know, I had no idea when I started where this journey was going to lead. I had no idea what kind of resources I was going to need. So I just took it one step at a time. And it's just as well if I had known I was going to have to figure out how to hire a really good CEO, a really good president, find a bunch of really top-notch engineers who are willing to work at a lot less than their market wages, raise $4 or $5 million, and now we're getting ready to raise that million. I would have thought, I can't do that. So fortunately, God showed me one step at a time. The next step always looked daunting, but it was just one daunt at a time. And if God's in it, then, you know, I think anything's possible. It did help being older and knowing a lot of people. Particularly, I knew some people that who were committed Christians who also had some pretty significant financial resources, because you can't raise the kind of money we're raising with a bunch of well-intentioned people giving $100 or investing $100, right? So, I actually taught a Sunday school class when I was a professor at Texas A&M, and some of my best contacts came from people who were in that class, who were my former Sunday school students and who I had a really good relationship with, who were really sharp business people and had started companies from scratch and done all of this. And one of them also happened to be a Christian from Indonesia, whose family still lives there, who was happy to find reasons to go back more often, and he was the one that went and found us a plant there. So I could never have done that. I don't speak the language, I don't know the local laws and the politics and stuff. So God brought an amazingly interesting and diverse set of people to help us be able to do this. And if I'd been planning my life for the last 10 years or 20 years, I couldn't have planned it better for what I'm doing now. God had already been doing that. So, yeah. I'm just glad I didn't miss it, and then I see the video reruns in my life when I get to heaven, what it was and what it might have been, and go, oh, crap, God set this thing up beautifully, and I'm so stupid. I'm just not paying attention, you know, kind of wandering through life, missing what God has for me. Okay, well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be here. And, thank you guys open.